Now, I want to remind you of a little bit of the history of cell biology. You already know the names of some of these people, but I want to remind you of who they are. Robert Hooke was the first person really to start studying cells, and he discovered cells while looking at a slice of cork under a microscope. And he noticed that there were all these compartments, and he was the first one to call them cells. Which brings us to the importance of the microscope in this unit. We're going to be using a microscope a lot, and so it's important that you know the parts of a microscope. And in your notes, you can always reference what those parts are called so that when you're reading directions in your labs, you know what it's talking about. The second person who was important to cell biology was Anton von Leeuwenhoek, and he was the first person to observe bacteria cells. And if you remember from the history lesson, he's also the person who was known for hand grinding his lenses, and he was very good at making lenses for a microscope. Matthias Schleiden is important because he's the first person to say that plants were made of cells, and Theodor Schwann kind of did the same thing for animals. He said that all animals must be made of cells. And lastly, Rudolf Virchow was the first person to say that a cell must come from another cell, that it doesn't just come out of nowhere. So these 5 men are very important, and together their work has been called the cell theory. So we've kind of summarized the things that they all discovered, and we call it the cell theory. And the cell theory says 3 things. It first says that all living things are composed of 1 or more cells. And notice that it does say living things, so things like rocks and minerals or chemicals or water, these things are not living and so they're not made of cells. But anything that is alive is made of cells. The second thing the cell theory tells us is that the cell is the basic unit of life, and this means that it's the smallest living thing. Up until now we've been talking about molecules like proteins and lipids. Those things are not living, but together they can make a cell, which is alive. The third and the last thing that the cell theory tells us is that new cells are produced when old cells divide in 2. So once again, it's the idea that cells don't come out of nowhere, they have to come from a pre-existing cell. Now there are 2 kinds of cells. There are eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. And the difference between these 2 is whether or not they have a nucleus. Eukaryotes have a nucleus in their cells, which is just a nice little compartment for the DNA. A prokaryote does not have a compartment for the DNA. Its DNA is just floating freely throughout the cell. So let's look at each of those in detail. First, prokaryotic cells. The word prokaryotic literally means before nucleus. The reason that they call these before nucleus is because in the process of evolution, the theory says that prokaryotic cells would have come first. They're simpler and less evolved than eukaryotic cells, so they came before there were any cells with a nucleus. There are 2 kingdoms that have cells that are prokaryotic. They are Archaebacteria and Eubacteria. And notice that both of these words have bacteria in the name, so that should give you a clue that any kind of bacteria is prokaryotic. In fact, anything that's not a bacteria is not prokaryotic. So everything that exists in the world that's not a bacteria is actually eukaryotic. Prokaryotic cells have no nucleus, and they also have no other organelles. So everything in the prokaryotic cell is just floating freely. There's no compartments inside the cell. They have genetic material, which is their DNA, but the location of their genetic material is just kind of fluid. It's always moving. You can kind of think about it like a wad of yarn or something like that. And we call the place in the cell where that DNA is found, we call it the nucleoid region. And so it's not a very clearly defined area, but it's a region in the cell. And these cells reproduce by asexual reproduction, which means they kind of just divide in 2, and it's a very simple process. Now let's look at eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells are more complex than prokaryotic cells. Eukaryotic means true nucleus. So if you look at these cells under a microscope, you're going to be able to see a very clearly defined nucleus. There are 4 kingdoms that have organisms that have eukaryotic cells. They are Protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. So protists, fungi, plants, and animals all have eukaryotic cells. Basically, anything that's not a bacteria has eukaryotic cells. An example would be a human. You have eukaryotic cells in your body because all of your cells have nuclei. Eukaryotic cells contain membrane-bound organelles, so they have other compartments in their cell besides just the nucleus. They have other things. Some of those things are things like mitochondria or chloroplasts, and we'll look at more of those later. They do have genetic material. They have DNA, but it's located inside the nucleus. And these cells reproduce by mitosis and meiosis, which are it's a more complex method of division than asexual reproduction, and we'll go into more detail studying mitosis and meiosis later in the year. These two kinds of cells actually do have some things in common. Both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells contain ribosomes, and ribosomes are important to a cell because they make protein, and for a cell to be able to grow, they have to have protein. And so both prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells need to grow, so they need ribosomes to be able to make protein. Both eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells have a cell membrane, which is just the outer covering of the cell. Both of them have DNA, and DNA, we remember from the last unit, is made of nucleic acid, so both of them have nucleic acid. And they both contain cytoplasm, and cytoplasm is sort of like the jelly filling of a cell. It's the sort of gelatin, it's a thick liquid that everything in the cell sort of floats around in. It's the filler material. Now there are two types of eukaryotic cells. So remember, prokaryotic cells do not have a nucleus, but eukaryotic cells do. And there are two different kinds of eukaryotic cells that both have a nucleus. So let's look at each one of those. First we have the animal cell, and the animal cell has a bunch of other organelles besides the nucleus as well. And at this point, it's important that you know what these organelles look like, but not necessarily what they do. So it's more important that you're able to recognize their shape than their function right now. Here in the lower corner, we have the Golgi apparatus. It's blue in this picture, and it looks like some folded sheets or material. Then we have the rough endoplasmic reticulum, which surrounds the nucleus, and it has all these little purple dots on it. Those purple dots are actually the ribosomes. And if you remember, ribosomes are where protein is made. So the ribosomes are located on the rough endoplasmic reticulum, and that's where protein is made. The nucleus is made up of the nuclear envelope and the nucleolus, which is the center of the nucleus. All together, this purple region is the nucleus. We have some lysosomes, which are sort of storage units in the cell, these little purple lysosomes. The cell membrane surrounds the entire animal cell, and it's very thin and fluid. We have mitochondria here that are shaped sort of like lima beans, and that's where energy is made by breaking down carbohydrates, so that's where the cell gets its energy from. We have the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, which is similar to the rough endoplasmic reticulum, but this smooth endoplasmic reticulum does not have ribosomes. That's why it's smooth, because it doesn't have ribosomes. And lastly, down here we have the centrioles, which are green, and they're used for cellular reproduction. So these are some of the things that you might find in an animal cell. In a plant cell, which is the other kind of eukaryotic cell, we have a cell wall, which is new. We don't have a cell wall in animal cells, but you can see how thick the outer covering is on this cell. That's why plants can grow to be so tall, because they have a cell wall to support them. So the cell wall is only found in plant cells. They also have a cell membrane, but it's on the inside, and it's also very thin, just like in the animal cell. Plants have chloroplasts, which is something that animal cells do not have. These green organelles here are all chloroplasts. And if you remember from middle school, chloroplasts are where photosynthesis is performed, and so that's where the plant gets its food, or its glucose. It performs photosynthesis to make glucose, and that happens in the chloroplast. Here, this large blue circle here is the vacuole. That's where water is stored for the plant. And you actually can have vacuoles in animal cells, you just didn't happen to have one in the picture. So vacuoles can be found in animal cells as well, but usually animal cells will have more than one smaller vacuole, and plant cells will have one large vacuole. And then we have the smooth endoplasmic reticulum, just like in the animal cell. We have some vesicles, which are similar to lysosomes. They're little storage units for the cell. We have the ribosomes, and they're located on the rough endoplasmic reticulum, just like in the animal cell. And then we have the nucleus, which is made up of the nucleolus and the nuclear envelope. We also have mitochondria, just like in the animal cell, and the Golgi apparatus is the same as well. So the things that are special here are the cell wall and the chloroplast. And those are important. It's important then that you remember that those two are found in a plant cell and only in a plant cell. So these are the two kinds of eukaryotic cells, cells with nucleuses.